All right. Before we begin, is there anyone would like to raise any issues or questions or themes from yesterday? Is there anything you'd like me to rehearse again, or anything that leaves you a little uncertain? Please be assured that if you don't know, there's at least a couple other people here who don't, and you'd be doing them a big favor. All right? Yes, sir.
What's the difference between a hypothesis and a proposition?
That's an interesting question. The character of a hypothesis is that it is something that needs to be demonstrated. In other words, I can give you a proposition. I can say, I'm trying to define proposition. Do you have a clear sense for yourself of what you mean by a proposition?
Well, I have been reading previous dissertations and thesis, and I've seen that some authors involve proposition, others involve
Oh, fine. What matters is not what you call it, but the character of it. I would, if it was hypothetical, I would use the term hypothesis, because it's something that can be testable. I mean, really, its strongest use is in the hard sciences. And although I haven't got biology envy or physics envy, a hypothesis signals to the reader that this is a hunch, a reasonable guess that can be substantiated, or indeed disproven. If you want to call it a proposition, fine, but I think in order to send a strong signal to the reader, I would call it a hypothesis if it had a hypothetical form. But don't write a dissertation without something that has an investigative character. That's all. Yes, sir.
I just Googled, when in doubt, you always Google. And what it says here is proposition is a statement or assertion that expresses a judgment or opinion, which is pretty much what a hypothesis is. And it says that hypothesis, theory, thesis, argument, premise, postulation, theorem, concept, idea, and statement are all synonyms for the word proposition.
Well, to a certain extent, and you've also just demonstrated the dangers of using Google. But how to put this? A hypothesis isn't an opinion. It's not a statement of fact. It's a contention. I think rather than proposition, I would probably, if I didn't use hypothesis, I would probably use the word contention. In other words, if I make a contention to you, you'd be more or less expected to say, what makes you think so? Or prove it. If I give you a proposition, and your response is, well, you're entitled to your opinion. Okay, fine. I mean, I could say democracy is the most beneficent in a benign form of government. I can't really. It's extremely difficult to investigate that, and your response would be, well, that's an interesting view. Okay, and it falls flat then. You see the difference? Don't get too caught up in language. Think about the quality of the hypothesis, or if you like, the contention or the proposition. What else? Somebody else was. Yes, sir.
So if we do the qualitative methodology, can we call it a hypothesis? Well, because I read somewhere that in qualitative it's hypothesis generating, and as opposed to when you do quantitative, it's hypothesis testing. I'm not clear on that.
Theory. Wait till you hear the session on qualitative methods, but in general I would say the qualitative approach is essentially it's a methodology. It's not the substance, it's the matter of how you go about it. I've had dissertations which required no field work at all. They were basically about the literature, and they were making judgments, often political subjects, from the literature. And so it was qualitative in that sense. And a quantitative thing if you're doing, if you're making an argument about trends in South African business, if you're saying, for example, that a certain financial trends are unsustainable, it almost has to be quantitative. You know, you're going to be bringing facts and figures to bear. I wouldn't, in broad terms, I would have you guard against getting too wrapped up in methodology. People write dissertations about methodology, but none of you are. You know, and I've had proposals from people who've got a theoretical framework and 2 methodologies, and I think, my God, where's the room for the substance? You know, you don't need to over-elaborate methodology. You simply have to bring to bear as much evidence as is required to substantiate your hypothesis. Okay? Is that broadly it? I mean, you're going to get into these things when you're working closely with your supervisor, but broadly, I'd say minimum baggage. You know, in other words, if methodology answers the question how, then pick a methodology that suits and stick with that. But you don't get any points, as it were, for over-elaborating a methodology. It drives me to exasperation as an external examiner for PhD dissertations when I see these elaborate methodological chapters that really weren't employed. And so they're set pieces. I can do them off the top of my head. According to author X, qualitative methodology is and according to author Y, and you can tell it's bolted on. It's not organic to the thing, and the student clearly feels that they have to show that they've looked at the methodological literature, even though they haven't employed it. And I think, you know, you really ought to have more confidence here. So I just think this doesn't have anything to do with where your heart is, and indeed where your focus lies. So.
Shouldn't the supervisor comes in? Shouldn't the supervisor be directing the student more clearly?
I'm going to talk about the supervisory relationship a little later on. And supervisors have all kinds of views. I mean, there's nothing wrong. I wasn't going to give a student a hard time because there was something that was essentially dead wood inside it. It could have been in any of those particular cases the supervisor said, better put in something about methodology, because you never know how quirky or how demanding the external examiner is. Fine, if it's not going to hurt you, put it in. And I think that's likely in a lot of cases. Supervisors, especially experienced ones, tend to err on the side of caution, and that's good, because you want all the reassurance you can get. All right? Questions? More comments? More? Okay. Before we begin this literature business, I'd like you to think about storytelling. All of us are accomplished storytellers. It's part of being fully adult and human. So when someone says to you, why did you choose to start your own business? What made you decide to do that? Or tell me about your career to date. Or tell me about your family. Your response is never, well, let me go away and think about it and organize it. Let me decide where to start. Spontaneously, there are 3 or 4 places you could start in answer to any question of that sort. It's really quite interesting. And in some ways, whatever your topic is, there's a natural worry about how far back should I go? Where do I actually begin the story? At what point does the literature matter? And remember, some of your literatures are going to be chronological. You know, they'll go back to 1990 or the institution of some law, or if they're historical, they'll go back to 1914 or something like that. Deciding those things as you're developing your hypothesis and your structure will come to you, I think, pretty readily. Someone asked me yesterday, where should I start? And I said, well, not from outer space. Whenever you pick up a book, if you've ever read a book of history or a book about contemporary politics, the authors never apologize for not doing the previous 6 centuries. You know, if you're an active reader, you accept the starting point that they give you. Now, as somebody interested in history, I sometimes read a history book and think, If I was going to write a history of the 20th century, I don't think I'd start in 1914. I think I might start in 1890. But there are lots of ways of telling a story that large. So at the very beginning, think generously. There are lots of ways of telling the story. And an argument is a story. It's got the same kind of character. Not necessarily beginning, middle, and end as we were taught when we were writing essays as school children, but rather like that. The virtue of that really basic beginning, middle, and end is that it's so easy to follow. And beneath, as I said yesterday, beneath all that richness and detail that you'll incorporate into a dissertation is a structure that's essentially simple and relatively easy to follow. You've ever listened to a bore? You ask them a question and before long the thing trails off. Whatever it is you wanted to know from them begins. Tell me about your career, and then 5 minutes later they're still talking about their eccentric great auntie. You can't follow it because they drift. The whole point about my emphasis on structure is that it's always clear that there's a really quite positive sense of direction. Not only a goal, substantiating the hypothesis, but a real clear sense of direction. Okay. You'll forgive me for writing prose. Don't you hate it when people write prose in PowerPoints and then stand in front of you and read it? I shall let you just drift through that quickly yourselves. If you're stuck at the moment or panicking a little bit and thinking, I've collected all this material and I don't know where to start, then it doesn't matter. Just start. Just start. Soon enough you'll know. The real point is not to stall, not just to tread water. You know, if you make a start in what for you is the wrong place, you'll know fairly quickly. This bores me. Or this is too narrowly focused. Where's the big stuff? Where's the foundational stuff? What are the classic works here? And of course, as you read, you'll also begin to realize what it is you don't know and probably have to find out. Don't dodge that. Always, always, always in a doctorate, and indeed in doing postdoctoral research, if you hit a problem, a block, an awkward fact that doesn't actually fit your hypothesis, or you discover there's a sub-literature you don't know anything about and you'd really rather not start something else, don't hide from things like that. It's part of having intellectual integrity and intellectual courage. So always when you hit a block, and this is what supervisors are really good for, make a virtue of a necessity. You know, in other words, don't hide from awkward facts because your external examiners, they'll bring them up. So you've got to be scrupulously honest about this business as well. Okay. Of course, it says, a literature. Oops, I need another one. Yeah, a literature doesn't contain everything. You know, it's not a complete catalog. And the larger the literature, the more challenging it is for you to edit it and shape it. Do you remember the two triangles that meet at a point? There's a reason why I've used a triangular shape. It's not just two rectangles with an arrow between them. The point is that you're reading through a succession of 3 or 4 chapters at the beginning, driving the reader. You're an editor. Think of it of being like a film director. You know, they see what you give them, and your reader is being driven, being directed to the point you want to focus on. So on one hand, you're demonstrating a mastery. You're showing that you've stomped all over this field. You know what you're talking about. But you're not going to talk about everything. You're going to talk about this literature in order to get them to realize that there's something we don't know about this. There's this vast arena of learning to which you're going to make a contribution. So you don't have to either apologize or agonize about where you start. You know, if you're doing supply chain logistics, start with supply chain logistics. I mean, you could, for example, because it's wide at the top and narrow at the bottom, you could talk about globalization and supply chains. We've had world trade for centuries, but supply chains for manufacturing now are extremely rapid. They're hugely complex. They're regulated by both international and national laws, etc., etc., etc. So you could, that kind of background, you could say we're living now in a highly interconnected world, and infrastructurally, one of the principal forms of interconnectedness is logistics. That's a good place to start, isn't it? And then if you were doing road logistics, the next thing would be about that. And then you narrow it down to your next bit, whatever it is. And then out. So the point is not just this vast pool of reading. You're recounting your reading for a purpose. In other words, although a literature survey is just that, it's a survey, it's actually a rather sneaky argument. It has an argumentative quality in that you're trying to narrow down to the point that matters to you. Right? So it's mastery of the literature, of course, but it's also highly directive. There's a point. There's a focus. Okay. And you remember the diagram yesterday, that top triangle, the first 3 or 4 chapters, it provides the rationale for doing what you're doing. Why should I care? Why should I care about water resources in Zimbabwe, or supply chain logistics, or UN peacekeeping missions, or whatever you like, leadership and middle management, or followership? You know, well, because I'm going to tell you why. Because this matters. Kind of like that. All right. So a narrative, a story. It also helps to think of it as a story. This is what we know about subject X. This is what we know about mega cities and solid waste management. It's not mine, is it? All right, so here we go. So I know you're going to get tired of looking at this diagram, but again, it's not a blueprint. It's how you think about it. And in many ways, that top triangle, now you understand, the top triangle should be very reassuring. You know, because the purpose of the literature review becomes more obvious. It's not just a great pool. Is that a ringtone? Whatever happened to blackbirds or little xylophone passages? Okay, but it's really, really helpful in that way, I think. I hope so. The other thing I wanted to say is if you still feel, despite your development of a hypothesis, the narrowing of your own intellectual focus, if in spite of the fact that you know that some reading is pertinent and some related but not so pertinent, you still think, dare I leave certain bits out? How do I do that? Well, one of the ways to do that is with footnotes or endnotes, whichever method you use. I'm going to talk to you about that in session 9, footnotes and endnotes. But whichever method you use, Harvard, the one that has parentheses in the text and it says Whitman 2005, or superscript, you know, the little number at the top, whichever one. One of the things that footnotes allow you to do is to signal your familiarity with literatures that are related but not directly pertinent. So there'll be a sentence of the sort, there is a considerable literature on the legal implications of X. Footnote. As soon as you say a sentence like that, and don't put a footnote down, you're in trouble. You write a sentence like that in order to signal. And there it is. And there's nothing to stop you putting down the 5 or 6 principal books on the legal, but you're not doing law, you're doing economics. But it's a signal. You know, this is an act of communication. And it's a very clever way of demonstrating mastery quite subtly. So if you get into a Viva and they say, well, you know, tell me why you didn't actually discuss law. And you say, well, it wasn't part of my rationale. Although, of course, I'm familiar with the literature, I did reference it, but I felt it would overweigh or skew the discussion one way or another. Question done. So I'll come back to this in session 8, but use that kind of thing very, very deftly. You need to be careful that you don't start writing bibliographical essays in the footnotes, a fault I was rather prone to. In fact, my external examiner said, why were there so many endnotes? Why are they so long? And I said, well, because I wanted the narrative to be nice and clean, so it would be easy to follow. Huh, he said. I passed. But it was also because I was so fascinated by the literature. And that was a tension similar to the ones that a lot of you are feeling. That was a tension that I felt. This is so interesting, and it's so obviously related. But it's a bit like the Shaggy Dog story. You know, you want the answer to a question, and I start talking about the eccentric ant. So just relegate it. It's a really good way of doing it. Okay. What's this? There's lots and lots of ways to do this well. Plenty. I actually prefer, at least in the many dissertations I've supervised, much prefer not to have a single chapter called literature survey, because it constrains you for a start. If it's in one chapter, it's a little bit narrow. And very often, for many dissertations, and perhaps for most, there's more than one literature. You know, they may be overlapping, but you know, if you're looking at the literature on refugees, for example, there are many sub-literatures on refugees. There are probably there must be all kinds of sub-literatures in managerial leadership. An extraordinary range. And you know, you don't have to conform to convention. Remember, this is your show, your film, your story. So you can start right away through editing, through the choices you make to shape that story, to bring the reader to the point of the argument. Do you remember I told you, I offered you an analogy yesterday with taking a case to the Supreme Court? Revisit that. Remember, you know, if you want to have your case heard by the Supreme Court, you have to spend a lot of time arguing that there is a case to answer. In other words, half the time spent in a Supreme Court case is getting to the starting line, presenting a rationale, and then the argument begins. And that's why, let's go back to the triangle. That's why very often, whatever it is you're going to be looking at, suppose it's water resources in Zimbabwe, or supply chain logistics in South Africa, very often your case or your particular focus doesn't even appear in the top half. It doesn't appear. So that I've run the battery out, I think. That's cool. Oh, there's always something. Never mind. You know, it doesn't have to be that way, but very, very often, that effort to create a rationale brings you to the point where you say, I've got a hypothesis about this, and the way I'm going to test it is by looking at this case or this theme. Right? You can start right away. It doesn't matter. It depends on what kind of story you want to tell. But very often, the actual focus of your study, the thing you come in the door on day one thinking you're going to do, doesn't actually appear until after that inflection point. All of my dissertations start this way, almost none of them finish that way. And it's, as I said yesterday, it's perfectly legitimate to start with the hypothesis and the methodology. Some examiners like it that way. You know, okay, you know, long story, but what are you going to do? There's no accounting for that. You have to tell it in your own way. And so long as it's comprehensive and coherent, it'll work. Yes, sir?
I just want to backtrack a little bit to the proposal itself. The portion of the proposal where you state your hypothesis, is it absolutely necessary to indicate you state your hypothesis and below that perhaps state the advantages associated with that hypothesis being proved to be true?
Okay, a couple of points here. Hypotheses in the non-physical sciences, I tend to use the word substantiate rather than prove. I tend to reserve proof for the physical sciences. You're hoping to substantiate it because very often the evidence that you accrue partly substantiates it or mostly substantiates it. Or appears to make a powerful case, but there's more research still to be done. That's why it says research implications at the bottom. Sorry, I missed the other part was.
No.
Oh, I can. Yeah, sorry, I remember that.
You know, because if you try to sort of almost justify your apart from everything that came before your hypothesis, you know, or whatever you've done in your proposal that brings you down to your hypothesis, is it always necessary to indicate what the advantages are associated with, or disadvantages as the case may be, that may be associated with proving the hypothesis?
No, it's not about, you don't have to make an argument about advantages and disadvantages. No lawyer will actually say to the Supreme Court justices, here are the advantages of hearing my case. They say, this is why it matters. This is why it's appropriate. You know, I know we get our heads wrapped up in whatever our intellectual passion is, and we realize the world's a lot bigger than our intellectual preoccupations, but you don't have to apologize for that. And there aren't any absolutes. Typically, and this is classic safe behavior, get to the point of the hypothesis underneath which you have 2, maybe 3 research questions. In other words, what do I need to find out in order to substantiate the hypothesis? What kind of data do I need? What kind of evidence do I need to accrue? And then the methodology. This is how I went about it. I mean, it's often in the past tense. These are the techniques I employed. Sometimes they're very straightforward. I had the student who did the use of social media by diasporas for influencing domestic politics. She had an extraordinary elaborate methodology because she was monitoring websites. And she kept records of all these. She had huge hard drives, freestanding hard drives to record all this data. I mean, she was looking at Rwandan websites that were, you know, on one side or another. It was a hugely elaborate thing. Most of our methodologies are much less elaborate, much less. The other thing is there are almost no absolutes in a dissertation, almost none. I did once hear of a tale. A colleague of mine told me that he had examined a dissertation and had no footnotes. And I said, what? And I said, and? He said, oh, it passed. He said, she wrote like an angel. And I said, she'd have to. Don't do radical. Don't do experimental. Be safe. I think that's ridiculous. But then maybe she was a genius. Oh, and by the way, I've never had a genius PhD student. Maybe I didn't recognize her. It doesn't take genius to do a PhD. If it did, there wouldn't be so many. And indeed, I wouldn't have one. Okay, let's get back to work, shall we? Okay, make a start. Write as you read. If you get an idea and you think, ooh, that's a clever insight, write. You need to be in the habit of writing as you're reading. You definitely need this. How should you write? Well, it depends. Sometimes you take notes from the books, sometimes you photocopy them, sometimes you photocopy articles. But keep I've mentioned and will mention again, keeping a supervision diary, but begin, have a notebook or have a stack of paper where you actually begin jotting down ideas. You won't remember them. If you get a bright spark and think, yeah, I remember that. No, you won't. You won't. And sometimes just that little germ, just that little spark is something that sets you off, gets your creative imagination running. And you have to be very systematic and about referencing, and especially with respect to direct quotations. The last session I'm going to give you, 9, is about citations. Sloppy citations drive me nuts. There's clearly a quoted passage without quotation marks around it. At doctoral level, you can be accused of plagiarism credibly for really sloppy work, even if your heart's pure, even if you've no intention of cheating or anything else like that. And of course, it becomes more dangerous and easier these days because all of us do so much cut and paste. I think, oh, there's a lovely quote from that article. Highlight, cut, paste. And a moment's distraction, and it's there and it's down as my prose. Even if your intention was otherwise. You've got to be very, very meticulous about this. It's part of being a pro. If you're a surgeon, the instruments have to be laid out precisely. Everything has to be exactly right, because the saving of life depends on it. This is your professional life. And it doesn't matter what the job is. The real mark of a pro, and I don't care whether it's the person plastering your home or the surgeon about to operate on you, is neatness and order. Sloppy work people, they don't succeed. They're not worth knowing. And what I highly recommend is that every piece of literature that you encounter, that you review, that is useful or you think is likely to be useful, or might comprise part of your bibliography, start your bibliography now, not at the end. Every student I've ever dealt with, and I confess, me too, spent a useless couple of days scrambling around looking for the source of a quotation because I couldn't find it. Keep a bibliography. The first thing to do when you come home with a stack of books, enter them into your bibliography. You can always cull it later. You think, well, I never read that one. I decided that wasn't pertinent, and you can delete it from your master list, as it were. And it's very reassuring as well to amass a bibliography as you're going on. I highly recommend it. You'll waste so much time if you don't do that, and you risk getting things wrong. You need the skill of skimming. I mean, I call it, quick overviews. I mean, most of you have got at least 1, 2, maybe even 3 degrees behind you. I'm sure you know how to do this, but you need to refine it, and especially at the beginning, you need to get a really powerful sense of whether something's going to be useful to you. So, I mean, the easiest thing is with edited books. I get an edited book, and it's about supply chain logistics, but none of them have anything to do with what I'm interested in. Because I can look at the titles and think, well, okay, it wasn't useful. But don't overlook bibliographies. They are gold mines, absolutely wonderful. Even the worst articles have got extensive bibliographies, and they very often contain key works that you would otherwise not encounter until much later on, if at all. So as you're skimming material, as you're reviewing to see whether it's worth investing your time, do have a look at the bibliographies. It's one of the first things you do. Now, as I said, with respect to looking at other PhD dissertations, the crude way of saying this is you need to gut them the way you would a fish. That is, if your purpose is to get a sense of what a PhD is, what the intellectual weight of it is, how they're organized, how they're expressed, then you can do that very quickly. Table of contents, bibliography, look for the hypothesis, have a look at the methodology, look at the chapter sequence, see how they're organized. And if it looks very good, read a chapter. Read the conclusion. And then you get a good sense. Ask your supervisor to give you a couple of good ones. Some supervisors, bless them, actually give their own dissertations to the student. There's a brave person. I'm not sure that I would. But get good ones, because there are indifferent PhD dissertations. If you only pick up one and it's actually relatively weak, you won't learn as much as you need to learn. I recommend, and I'm not being ambitious for you here, get half a dozen. Yeah, I know, it looks like that. So what? You're PhD students. You should do that before breakfast. And get a sense of them. And you might hit one you think, ah yes, now I get it. And don't be daunted. It can be real scary looking at them, thinking, how am I going to get to 100,000 words from a standing start? Same way I did, same way all of us do, right? Okay. Bibliographies. I mentioned footnotes and endnotes. It's a brilliant way of keeping those top chapters simple in structure but rich in detail. Indeed, you can even take the detail away from the narrative and tuck them in behind. So it's a real clever way of doing it. Okay. In every field, there are lots and lots of people, even established academics, who haven't read some of the foundational texts. I know lots of people in international relations who've never read, I don't know, everything from Thucydides to Machiavelli to early 20th century texts, E.H. Carr and others. You will greatly weaken yourself if you don't read whatever are the key texts in your field. I'm not saying you have to go all the way back to Plato and Aristotle. Of course not. And here supervisory guidance is key too. There are always the basic texts that everybody in your field should know about. Read them. Don't just know about them, like a lot of people do. I know about Nietzsche. I know about... No, not if you haven't read it. I know about Rousseau. I know about Locke. Read them. Read them. It's part of intellectual honesty and integrity. Okay. And again, the hypothesis and the tentative structure arise together. They arise jointly with the reading. I know it's so very difficult. It's a little scary because you feel you haven't got your feet on the ground. Read. The easiest way of getting your feet on the ground is reading and thinking, what's my focus? Where's my heart? What can I do? What can I contend about this? What don't I know? You know, if you're in a highly dense populated field like management studies and leadership studies, and again even I'm familiar with some of those books. I mean, that's how rich the literatures are. It's actually in some ways particularly challenging, you know, to find a way in, to find out what's missing, to do something that actually passes the so what test. And you've got to make tracks. One of the things I would do in that kind of position is to try to separate out the genres. You know, so there's an academic literature, there's the literature from former chief executive officers, you know, how I turned my company around and how I conquered the world and all that sort of stuff. They're all over the place. There's another literature on corporate organization and leadership. There's another about the sort of social psychological aspects of it, and separate them out. And I'm not picking on you, but in your particular case, you think that the CEO stuff is fascinating stories, but it's not academic, it's not intellectual. So farm them out. I'm not interested so much in theories of organization. Too abstract for me. I'm not, and you can begin to get a sense of the field. You're getting a top-down view of it. There's the opposite problem, which is your area of focus doesn't have a very rich literature. Does anybody feel in that position? Have you all entered a field where there's a lot of work has already been done? Oh, goody. Okay.
I think I can relate with being overwhelmed, like it's a lot of research that's been done, because my area, my topic is the role of management accounting in creating and sustaining competitive advantage. So that really is a strategic management topic, even though it's an accounting. So
Yeah.
So there is a lot of research on strategic management and on competitive advantage. So it kind of gets difficult to streamline and say this is what I'm going to focus on. And especially in the identification of the gaps.
Okay, but the reason you've got the problem is because you've got a research area rather than a research focus. You don't even have a focus yet, never mind a hypothesis. Sure, and look at accounting as the principal means of maintaining a competitive edge in business. Great. Sounds very commonsensical to me. Entrepreneurs who are good at securing business but can't actually handle the day-to-day usually fail. An entrepreneur needs an accountant. We all know this. Okay. So how are you going to get past something that's actually pretty obvious and easy to demonstrate into something that's contentious or not well understood? The challenge is not because there's so much of it, but because you don't know what part of it is most needs looking at. And I say again, and I mean this quite genuinely, find your heart. Find out what it is that really seizes you. I like to say that you ought to have a passion for this. Well, that may be a little bit, you may not like that term, but you have to be fascinated by it. The stage you're at is normal. That's where I expect most of you to be. But you're not going to solve that problem just by reading. You need to be confronting that directly. And I know it'll be like throwing yourself against a wall sometimes. It's really hard. But sometimes when you read or you skim through some aspects of the literature, finding out what you don't want at least begins to clear the field. But your work, if I was supervising you and I saw you every week, I'd say, go on, what's this dissertation about? What are you investigating? And you can't answer that off the top of your head. But that's the problem. It's partly a literature problem, but not only a literature problem. How do you get the focus? By reading. What do you read? Your focus will tell you. And they need to join together. That's what's scary. That's what's hard. But don't give up on finding something that is unique to you, because that's going to be your contribution to knowledge. And go back to what we were talking about yesterday. Think of it in terms of even in organizational terms. So you could look at global, national, and local companies. You could do it by scale. You could do it by geography. You could do it by the nature of the business. There are probably different forms of accounting. There's in-house accounting and bought-in accounting. There are themes, which is forward planning, day-to-day administration, and recovering historical stuff. There are software and computing problems, a huge area and problem in accounting. There's the business of keeping up with regulations. Some corporations, by the way, occasionally fail like that when a government changes the regulation. They have a business model that's narrowly premised on a certain kind of provision. Say government provision for health. Government changes the law and the business goes. I know of a few cases personally. So it's incredibly rich. So open yourself out. That too is scary, but the alternative is even scary. You think, what am I doing? Right? Okay. Okay. Here are the risks. If you're not fully engaged, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. The risks. If you're not fully engaged in reading, your hypothesis won't develop. It just won't. And if you're reading without the creative driver being the development of your hypothesis, you'll drift. That's the risk for you. Right? Mastery of the literature and conceiving a strong hypothesis. That's your goal. That's it. And again, it's a story. It's a story. I've only got one more. You need to be ambitious. You need to seek this stuff out. You know, it's out there. All these riches are out there somewhere. And sometimes not all that easy to find. That's one of the things bibliographies are good for. Does UKZN Library have an interlibrary loan system? Good. Are you registered with the library? You're all registered? You've restored my faith. Good. Use the library. I don't know if UKZN Library has a subject librarian. Say if you're in business and commerce. If they have a subject librarian, these people know all kinds of things. You know, they have, I mean, there may be government data sources about which you know nothing. There may be you know, standard references. There might be online references, things that would actually save you a lot of time or enter you into new literature arenas. You've got to be hungry and search for this stuff. You got to look out for it. What's your electronic access like to journals? Is it okay? Is it?
Yeah, it is.
Wow, I'm impressed. Really, it's good. Anybody feel that it's not? It's okay, but not. Oh, you are lucky. Good for you. But do go in and do talk to librarians. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I think I have experienced a bit of a problem on that because some of they tell you that if the article is not open, like it's not payable, you can send the link to the library, right? But in practice, it's a bit difficult to follow up on those articles. Yeah.
Nobody said it was easy.
Yeah.
And it's a pain because sometimes you have to see the article to know whether it's going to be useful to you. Yeah, I know. I mean that's hard. But help each other. Sometimes, look, I know this goes on. I've got all of my graduate students were connected to other graduate students who sometimes had library access that they didn't have, and they would help each other. You know, can you send me XXX, or because you can download these things as PDFs. If you've got a network of colleagues, use the network, be generous, and don't be frightened to ask for help. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I've noticed with UNISA, they are much better in terms of online libraries. So I've got folks who are registered with UNISA, and here and there, they also, I can just send them a list of articles that outline the download.
Did you hear that? Yeah. You've just made a lot of friends. One of my students had a close friend who was in Harvard, which has a fabulous library. She was very lucky, but she was also very generous. She helped quite a few of her colleagues with things that they couldn't get. So it was very nice. It's precisely that kind of thing. Yes, sir. Thank you for being patient.
Yeah, one of the approaches that I saw is helpful. I've registered with a site called ResearchGate, whereby if you have a problem, you can actually just throw it in, and people just come with ideas, some share the literature, the documentation.
ResearchGate. Have a look. Do, by all means, have a look. Just don't get blown off course. That's all. And when I talk about supervisors this afternoon, that's something else I'll say. You can ask anybody for help, but be supervised by one person. You know. All right. What else? Anything else? Anybody who's not going to be at the session at 11 o'clock want to raise their hypothesis or their research idea or raise a question? What do we got? Nobody wants. Yes, sir.
I have a question related to citation.
Citations.
Citation. If I have two sentences that are logical, and these are not direct quotes from the literature, and I basically get these two from, as I said, the two sentences are coming from two different sources. But at the end of these two sentences, I only have one source that I cite from. What is the risk there?
The fast answer to the question is to a question you didn't ask, which is don't take any risks. In other words, we can talk more about this in session 9. If in doubt, offer a citation. If you have quotation marks around it, if it's taken from an article or a book, you have to cite it. But if you get an insight, or if there's a book's been particularly useful to you in recounting a history, cite it. There won't be a particular page reference, but it'll be such and such a book published in 2005. It's just a piece of intellectual honesty. And if you join two quoted passages from two different sources, you've got to show the quotes differently. In other words, quotes around the first bit and quotes around the second bit, even if they're joined together in one sentence. And then you can put, a Smith 2010, page 5 for the first, and then a semicolon, and Whitman 2015, page 33 for the second, or respectively. Just anything that's quoted directly, anything that is not yours, you need to cite. And for the rest, where it's not directly quoted, but where you're intellectually indebted, I think it's a piece of intellectual honesty just to honor it, to show it.
My issue is not the direct quotes. I said you are not quoting directly.
Okay.
In the case where you do not quote directly, but you sort of interpret. Okay, so
the phrase, we talk about paraphrasing. Sometimes things are really badly expressed, or I want to express it in my own prose way. Then it's intellectual honesty. You cite it, but without a page reference. You show your debts. You honor what you've got. Do you need that in session 9? Do you need the particulars of how to do citation? Because most of you have master's degrees, don't you? Do you need that? Do you want that? Are you too embarrassed to say yes? Or are you too offended to say no? Which? I'll see if I can dig something out. Okay, I'll see what I can do about that. And of course, if it bores you, then you can just drink tea and nap or walk out. No bad thing to get a bit of a refresher. But citations, referencing and all that, it's not difficult. You choose a style and stick with it. But it's just painstaking. That's all. You just have to work and get it precisely right. The drafts that I get from students that are referenced with great care tend to be high quality. And the ones that are poorly referenced and poorly, naturally, they tend to be intellectually weak. Because it's all part of scrupulousness. It's all part of taking good care. All right? I'm very early this morning, so we're 10. I'm gonna let you go, unless you want to raise something? Anything? Want to have a bash? Okay,